In this video, I'm going to check out the most common mistakes that admins must never make when working with Entra ID. So if you're ready to learn, let's check it out. Hi everyone, Andy Malone. Nice to see you. Hey, especially if this is your first visit. On today's episode, I'm checking out administrative mistakes that are so easy to make in Microsoft Entra ID. These are things that administrators should definitely try to avoid in terms of setting up and configuration, as well as management. Just a quick mention that today's episode is sponsored by SquareX.com, an amazing security tool, but more from them a little bit later. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, we'd love to have you on board. So go ahead, click on that subscribe button up there and ring that bell and come and join my learning community. And if you've got questions about this or any of my other sessions, as always, just get those down below. Just a quick reminder as well that I'm going to be at Microsoft Ignite this year, as well as Tech Mentor in Orlando and Chicago. So if you're going to be around at any of those conferences, it would be great to see you. All right. Anyway, I think without any further ado, I think it's about time we jump in. What do you say? Let's look at these common mistakes that are so easily made and how to fix them. Enjoy. Okay, so for my first thing that I want to just quickly mention, I'm going to come into Microsoft Entra here, and you can see that I've got Alex's account. And you'll notice that when I click onto the Licenses tab, you are no longer able to assign licenses in Microsoft Entra ID. And in fact, this is a perfect example of how Microsoft are starting to bring the portals together. So you can now do this. If I flip over here into Microsoft 365, click onto Alex's account here, and then click onto the Licenses and Apps pane, you'll now see that this is now where you assign those licenses. If you don't see the licenses that you want, or you want to purchase additional licenses, you can still do this in Entra ID. I don't know for how much longer, but you can also do this as well by going into the marketplace here, purchasing your products or doing the trial subscriptions to the various products, and then assigning the licenses in Microsoft 365. Now, also just one thing to remember, for admins, generally speaking, you don't need a license for admin accounts. And also just one thing to remember, there are quite a few third-party licensing things that you might need now. So for example, the Intune suite and things like if I go into the E5 subscription here, it might not include things like Teams or even Teams Premium now. Now also, it's another major consideration, of course, to things like identity governance. So identity governance here, you can see that lifecycle workflows isn't included with the E5 subscription, but you do actually get a few things that are there. So things like PIM, privileged identity management, that comes with a P2 license. Things like access reviews rather, and entitlement management, again, depending on the subscription that you're using, these may or may not be available. Something that comes with the Entra suite is the verified ID. You also get permissions management and the super sexy, of course, global secure access, which is Microsoft's Secure Service Edge subscription. You can purchase these individually, but again, it is actually cheaper to purchase them as a whole. But remember, the key thing is you do need a P2 license on top of this. So you can see if you wanted things like Copilot, which is an extra $30 a month, if you want Teams and Teams Premium, if you want the entitlement management, you know, those monthly costs are starting to creep up. But there you go. So the key thing here is that you can now assign licenses there from within Microsoft 365 and no longer in Entra ID. Now, something that's becoming very apparent as a potential problem for admins is multi-factor authentication, and there is quite a number of areas where you need to be able to configure this. So first of all, we need to think about our default settings, and our default settings for the tenant, I'm going to simply come into the protection, And one of the first choices that you guys need to make, of course, is the authentication methods. So what authentication methods are you going to support? Now, I've done a number of sessions on this, but ultimately we're looking at obviously FIDO keys or the new passwordless options. So passkeys, of course, can now be deployed on mobile devices, and they can sync with things like your Apple keychain and your Azure Key Vault and things like that. It's all super exciting. Just remember that there are a number of kind of potential vulnerabilities with things like voice call and SMS. There has been evidence that, again, these could potentially be tampered with. So at this point, it's super important that you set up your multi-factor authentication. Of course, this tenant is actually pre-configured, and you can see the Microsoft Authenticator settings. Definitely make sure that you've switched on things like one-time passcode, include the name of the application and also the geographic location, because when the user receives that message that, for example, they're trying to log into Teams in Sydney, Australia, and they're currently in Oslo in Norway, that's not right. So, and it's just an additional layer of security. So in the authentication methods as well, the other thing that's definitely worth configuring are something called authentication strengths. So of course up here you can configure your own authentication strength. So I can create, for example, the sales authentication strength here. I can choose an authentication strength level. Of course, you really want to avoid these options down at the bottom. They are potentially hackable. So I can click next, of course. Just a quick warning about be careful with admins, of course. You don't want to lock yourself out and get into problems. So again, I'm going to go ahead and click on create, and I can now assign this to a policy in conditional access. So on the subject of multi-factor authentication, I'm going to come back into my protection tab. And here in protection, of course, you've also got multi-factor authentication. So in here, very important, of course, are your tenant settings for multi-factor authentication, and particularly useful because you've got account lockout here. This is where you can set the policies. So number of MFA triggers. So for example, how many denials. So again, you could set your policy here, for example. So you could set your, I want to say I give them 3 attempts, 10 minutes, of course. And let's say you can say 60 minutes until the account is automatically unblocked. So again, you can choose that for your entire organization. The other thing that you can also do is you can manually block users here as well. So for example, let's say I have a user here called Cameron, and he's lost his phone. You might want to, for security reasons, you might want to go and lock his account out. So again, you can block that user so he won't be able to log back in. Now, of course, I can then, he's got a brand new phone, he comes back to me, I can then say, yep, okay, I want to then unlock this account. So of course you will need to put in a reason. So I'll just say that he's found his phone and everything looks okay. And of course this is all logged, and you can see it goes into the date and time, and it goes into the audit logs there as well. So again, this is a really useful page. Just to mention as well that another potential hiccup that admins run into, certainly in this area, is if I go into the users, and you can see that I can also come into, let's say, Cameron's account here. You also have things like per user MFA changes. So not only can you set this up at the tenant, you can configure it through conditional access. Just to remind you that you can also configure this at the actual individual level as well. So for example, I've got a user called Nestor here. I can enable so you can see here, I've got a user called Nestor here. If I can enable the MFA, this is kind of similar to what we used to have in Microsoft 365. I can enable that now. I can also configure here the per user settings. So again, Do you want to require the selected user to provide the contact details, delete any existing passwords, settings, restore multi-factor authentication on all remembered devices? So again, very useful. Definitely have a look at this. But again, be careful with this. I think it's important to definitely set it up at the tenant level and then individually here as well. Okay, so that's the individual multi-factor policies. So you can see here, before you begin, take a look at the deployment guide, really useful. And again, be careful that you don't lock out admins. On the subject of locking out admins, it's definitely recommended that you have a break glass account. So a break glass account is essentially an account that is not enabled with MFA. Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that, but you could enable it, for example, using a passkey, a physical passkey. That might be a potential solution. I'd love to know what you think about that, actually. And the best practices are you should have at least 2 break glass accounts. Again, with extremely complex passwords, lock them away just in case things go horribly wrong. Today's sponsor is SquareX.com. Detect, mitigate, and threat hunt. For the ultimate in-browser detection and response, visit them today at SquareX.com. So again, a couple of areas that admins can easily miss out on can be found here in the properties page of Entra ID. So simply come into here. If you scroll right down to the bottom, you'll find security defaults. Now you'll notice that in this example, I'm actually running conditional access. So I've actually gone in advance and I'm doing conditional access. But if you've got a brand new client straight out of the box, this is a fabulous tool just to come in. And again, it will just set up things like multi-factor authentication for all of your users. Details on it you can find here. There's a really nice article on learn.microsoft.com. But if you're not a security guru, I highly recommend this. Beyond that, of course, you can then configure conditional access policies. So one key thing there, security defaults, very useful. Now, on top of really useful things, if you now go into settings, amazing how many admins miss this. This is the preview hub. Now, there are lots of new features constantly being added to Entra ID, and you can see that I can come in and I can switch these features on, and they can make a difference in terms of reporting. One little thing though, how long do they stay in public preview depends on what the product actually is. So for example, entitlement management was in public preview for almost 3 years. And then of course, when it goes live, it became a paid service, which can be a little bit of a pain. So again, watch out for that. Just to give you an example of this, by the way, if I scroll down and if I come into, let's say, conditional access. So in here, you've got conditional access. You might get new features in conditional access. You might, things like authentication methods. This is an example of one that's just come in. As well as your authentication methods policies here that you've got with Microsoft, you also have the ability to create another external authentication method. And you can see that this one is actually in public preview. So if you've got like a third-party app, something like that you want to use, again, you can bring that third-party app in here and use that as an external authentication method. So that's just an example of those preview features. And again, these are all well documented, so check it out. So one of the most concerning aspects of Entra ID is guest access, and ensuring that you have the right guest access or default settings for this is super important. So I'm coming into the main portal here, and I'm going to come in to external identities, and I'm going to come down here to external collaboration settings. So these are your default settings for your tenant. So you can see here that we have guest user access restrictions. So guest users have the same settings as members. So it's really important to know that when you create a guest account, you can create either a guest or an internal member to your organization. Sometimes, however, guests can be really useful because they might be, for example, contractors, and you can give them member permissions if you want to do that. But you can see here that we have three distinct options. Guest users have the same access. Guest users have limited access to properties and membership, so they can see the directory objects, they can see users, and they can see some of the properties of those users, but not all of the properties. Whereas here, this most restrictive, they can only basically see their own properties. So again, setting this at the default level is super important. Now, in addition, we also have this one as well. So who's allowed to invite guests within your organization? So anyone in the organization can invite guests, including guests and non-admins. Oh my goodness. So if you've invited a guest, they can invite a whole bunch of other guests. And this is the default setting. That's concerning to me. Member users and users assigned to specific admin roles. So for example, if you're a Teams owner, for example, you own a Teams group, you automatically become a member of the guest inviter role. Or you can do it where only specific admin roles can invite guests. And of course, then you can actually select those particular roles. Or the most restrictive, of course, is no one in the organization. Again, you really don't want to probably do that because then you lose all the capabilities to do the collaboration. The other thing that you've got as well is when a user joins your organization, they can also go into their user profile and they can select the Organizations tab and leave the organization. And this in turn deletes the guest account. So again, it's on by default, but if you don't want to allow users to leave, again, you probably want to put that in your terms and conditions though. Really, really important. You can also, of course, restrict or allow collaboration or invitations to be sent, or restricted. So you've got those three options here. So just to say, for guest access, this is such an important setting, guys. You definitely need to get this right. Now, when it comes to security, you simply cannot afford to make mistakes, especially with the likes of applications. So here in Microsoft Entra ID, I can come in and of course I can deploy many applications to my users. There are some great applications here, literally thousands of them. But of course, users don't just install applications here. They can also install applications through Microsoft 365, through Intune, through Microsoft Teams, and so on. And if you get the security configuration settings wrong here, it can be quite, well, shall we say, embarrassing. Now, I'm sure that you've all seen OAuth prompts that look a little bit like this. And in many cases, the permissions that it requires is not that dramatic. It needs access to your calendar. It just use your profile data and so on. But some applications can be quite malicious. And if you're not using tools like Defender for Cloud Apps, then it's really super important that you protect your tenant. And you can do that simply by coming down here into applications. And of course, obviously be careful what the applications that you're setting. But here in the applications pane, if I scroll down here, you have some options which are quite important. One, it says consent and permissions. So again, we have some kind of default settings here that are worth noting. So do not allow user consent. So again, this is a little restricted here, and users would not be able to install applications because they would not be able to get that OAuth prompt. Now, this might be if you've got a dedicated administrator who is just dedicated at installing apps for users, or maybe you have some kind of request process. Allow user to consent from verified publishers. Again, this is probably the safest option here. And again, you can configure this and you can set your own classifications, for example. So for example, what permissions can your users see and so on. allow consent for any apps, in my opinion, is a little bit dangerous. For example, recently I went to a speaker website. I'm a speaker at conferences, and when I went, it basically wanted over 22 different permissions, and you simply can't do that. So you can come into those settings here, and you've got this admin consent requests. So if you're not allowing your users to consent to apps, then obviously, depending on how sensitive your environment is, you might then choose this option here. So who is allowed to review the consent request? So by default, again, it's asking you, do you want particular users, groups, or specific admin roles? So you can see here the consent request will expire after X number of days, and the default here, of course, is 30 days. So again, take a look at the admin consent request, very useful. Now, if you want to go deep into this a little bit more, you can see that you can come into the permission classifications where you can actually determine what is risky and what is not. You've got 3 levels, low, medium and high. I suggest obviously that at the low level, you can actually configure your own and add in your own permissions here. Definitely check out the Microsoft documentation on this. You can click here for more details. Definitely worth knowing, but be very careful with this. It could potentially leak data if it's not configured. So there you have it, my top mistakes that admins can make when working with Microsoft Entra ID. Did you spot anything in there that you've done? I'll bet there is. Hey, listen, I hope you've enjoyed the session. If you did, give me a big thumbs up. It does make a difference to the channel. And if you've got questions and comments, as always, get those down below. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for dropping by today. Here's a couple of videos that you may enjoy. And while you're here, go ahead, click on the subscribe button and you won't miss out.